Welcome back to Pursuing Justice. I'm Harriet Hendel, and the last podcast that we did was with Seth Miller, who is the executive director of the Innocence Project of Florida. And if you're tuning in now, I would strongly suggest that you go back and listen to Seth's part one interview, because this is really part two, and you'll have some background on a particular case that we're talking about that the Innocence Project of Florida became very involved with. And it's the case of Dean McKee. So we talked about the project itself, the work that the project does in helping people who are innocent overturn their cases if possible. And now what I would like to do is welcome Seth back. Welcome, Seth. Good to have you with us again. And we will be talking about Dean McKee's case. So what we were talking about before, if you can kind of maybe do a very quick overview of the case for listeners to bring them up to speed, that would be great.
Sure. So Dean McKee was convicted of a 1987 Tampa murder that was a stabbing of a black man who was a vagrant at outside the Tampa Museum in the middle of the night. And we always sort of had the sense when after we had fully reviewed the case that something was amiss. Dean was maintaining his innocence and saying that his brother actually committed this crime, but had framed him in order to make sure that his brother, did not get a death penalty because he was over 18, and he thought that his younger brother, Dean, who was 16, would get off lightly. And in fact, Dean got a life sentence as a juvenile for his conviction in that crime. And so when we interacted first with Dean's case, we did so because he had already initiated a procedure to get DNA testing on fingernail scrapings that were taken from this poor man who was stabbed, because naturally they collect that evidence because it could tell you who did and who did not deposit their DNA underneath the fingernails during that kind of violent act. And so Dean was already in the middle of this when we got involved, and in fact the court was sort of not doing it correctly, and in fact didn't finish the DNA testing in order to compare Dean's DNA to the DNA found underneath the victim's fingernails. And what we found when we got involved and were able to get Dean's DNA profile is that there was DNA underneath the fingernails that was foreign to the victim that did not match Dean McKee. That was suggestive of the fact that this crime did not happen as Dean's older brother said it happened. And in fact, it supported our theory that Dean's older brother was the one who actually committed this crime, that actually, stabbed the victim. The victim likely scratched his older brother when he committed the crime. And this was now a new piece of evidence that could get us back into court and allow us to fully reinvestigate the case and bring any evidence that supported Dean's innocence to bear in the new legal proceeding.
Now, in the the late 80s, tell us what the story was with DNA testing. Where was it at that time?
Well, in December 1987, when this crime happened, there was no forensic DNA testing that was, available, for criminal investigative purposes. It didn't come into first use in Florida until the following year, and it wasn't in use at the time of his trial. And so, luckily for us, they collected this evidence, and then luckily for us and luckily for Dean, they kept it all of those years, because we didn't even get involved in the case until really 22 years after he had been convicted. And so every one of these cases, it's a minor miracle that some crime lab or police agency or clerk of court has kept evidence on some shelf in a paper or plastic bag for 1, 2, 3, or even 4 decades, where we can still use the modern science today in order to completely put the pieces of the puzzle together and unlock the truth. that is, in some of these cases, really the miracle, not the result, but the fact that the evidence exists in the first place.
That it's been kept. And so often I read about cases similar to this, and it is so shocking to me that after decades, not just years, but decades, that evidence is kept. Is there a standard time frame where states can say, well, we're tossing this evidence out, we don't need it anymore, this man has been convicted and he's in prison? How does that work?
Well, in a lot of places don't have any standard, procedures or rules that govern evidence preservation. In Florida, we do now have such a thing for evidence that might contain DNA. We've had it since 2001, where we have mandatory preservation through the end of the person's sentence, and if they're on death row until 90 days after their execution. But that didn't come into place until 2001. So up until that point, evidence holding agencies were free to create routine retention schedules that allowed for the destruction of evidence routinely pursuant to those retention schedules. And so in about 40% of the cases where we would like to do DNA testing, the evidence just doesn't exist because it was destroyed, in the 80s or 90s, or in some cases it was destroyed even later, contrary to what the law was. And so, yes, if the law was in place to preserve and they violated the law, that's a bad thing, but that doesn't help us to do the DNA testing if the evidence doesn't exist. You need evidence to exist to do the testing.
Now, what if, in his case, the evidence had been destroyed? What would have happened? What would have been the outcome?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because, some of the other evidence that was really key in the case, and so the DNA testing got us in the door, but I think the evidence that helped us win the case and overturn his conviction was actually something that had nothing to do with DNA. And so Dean's older brother, Scott, over time, had girlfriends and, married a woman. And, so he only went to prison for a year and then got out. And, lived a life, and he had relationships. And over those times, he told a lot of the women that he was with, things that suggested or affirmatively stated that he framed his younger brother, for a murder that he actually committed. And so, we were able to do that investigation and get those statements from those individuals. And so that was certainly really important evidence. But the problem is that I think if that's all we had, we might not have been able to get back into court because of the really restrictive procedural rules about what qualifies as new evidence. I think a court would have said, look, yes, this is interesting evidence and maybe even, exculpatory evidence, but it's stuff you should have found earlier. So we're not now, more than 2 decades after the person's been convicted, we're not now going to allow you to reopen the case based on something that could have been found earlier. Now, with the DNA, we did not have that problem because once you get a DNA result, the law in Florida automatically treats that as newly discovered evidence that allows you to reopen your case. And so I would say that while the DNA testing results might not have been what won the case, ultimately, factually, it was in fact what allowed us to go win the case. And I think Dean would still be in prison today, or maybe just getting out on parole if as a convicted murderer, if we didn't have that DNA evidence. Right.
Now, you said that the Innocence Project stepped in, did you say about 2010? Is that accurate?
We started communicating with Dean in 2010, and I recall vividly the first court appearance I made on his behalf was in March 2011.
Oh, okay. And then years go by because he did not get out officially until very early this year in January. Is that correct?
Well, he actually got out. He got out. So I'll maybe rewind and give you precisely what happened. So
Sure.
We came into his case officially in court in 2011. We got his case on track, got those DNA test results, and in 2013 we filed a motion based on all this new evidence that we had. We had an evidentiary hearing in 2014 and 2015, and then in December 2017, the judge finally overturned his conviction, which we thought was going to end the case right there. But the state decided that they didn't like that result, and instead they appealed the grant of a new trial. And so once they did that, we felt like, look, he deserves to be able to get out on bond, because he would be entitled to bond had we just gone to a new trial phase, and they might even drop the charges. But the only reason he's still locked up is because the state appealed a decision. They're not going to win the appeal, and it might take a year. And the state attorney agreed to a bond. And so in January 2018, he got out on bond, of course, with a monitor around his ankle,
right,
with severe restrictions on his movement, curfews, a lot of stress that he would, for something small that had nothing to, that was only technical, that he would get sent back to jail or prison. But after the state finally dropped that appeal, they gave it up. In January 2019, they finally dropped the charges, which paved the way for its exoneration.
Right. But look how long it took. And I think what I'd like listeners to understand is every case is very, very different. Some are solved or are overturned quickly. But why does it take so many years from the beginning as you stepped into the case, even though he had done some work on his own, until he is declared a free person and can walk away as a free man? Why does it take so long?
Well, I think there's a number of spots where things can get delayed. Now, of course, after we got the DNA test results, we don't run straight into court and go file, because we want to fully reinvestigate the case to see what else we can find, so that when we do go to court, we put our best foot forward. So we took over a year to do that investigation, went to see witnesses in multiple states, and put together a factual record that, in addition to the DNA testing, fully supported his innocence. So we'll take the hit for taking that time, but it was time well spent, because we uncovered the evidence that really led to his exoneration. But once you put a case into the court, so in this case in 2013, sometimes the state will agree to relief and it happens all very quickly. But when they oppose, which they did in this case, and you have to fully litigate a case, it can just take months and years to do. And then, in this case, we had a wonderful judge, but she just took a long time to make a decision, almost 2 years to make a decision. It was, obviously she overturned the conviction and wrote a wonderful order, and that was really important to us. But it did take a long time, and it was a lot of agony and agonizing on Dean's part, and his family's part, and our part. But that's, that is the machine of justice is slow and never quick enough for our liking. And some of our clients, they their mothers die, they lose relationships, they get sick themselves, and have debilitating illnesses where they could get better health care if the system moved more quickly to get them out. And so I think the overarching principle is that the system is not designed to free an innocent person. It's designed to preserve a conviction, regardless of whether it's a wrongful conviction. And when push comes to shove, it really takes us moving mountains to get someone out. We don't succeed because of the system. We succeed in spite of a system that is hell-bent on keeping our clients in prison.
Right. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is you've almost answered it, is sense of frustration that you must feel with not just Dean's case, but so many. And I know that the Innocence Project of Florida is usually working on over 30 cases simultaneously. But